can I please invite Anita Hansen, a research matron from Liverpool University Hospitals Trust, up to the stage to talk to us about the SJS passport in accident and emergency, potential to prevent hospital admission becoming more complex. Anita.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Firstly, I just wanted to say my presentation is a little bit different. It's not about preventing admissions to the emergency department. It's more about a tool that's been developed to try and support patients while they're attending the emergency department and beyond. And so my name's Anita Hansen. I'm a research matron at Liverpool University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, and for the last 20 years or so I've worked delivering the clinical pharmacology research portfolio on behalf of Professor Sir Munir Pir Mohammed. But today, I just wanted to talk really about a study that I recently completed myself as part of my PhD. And I'm going to talk about the co-production of the My SJS passport. And for those of you who have not heard of SJS or Stevens-Johnson syndrome, it's a potentially life-threatening adverse drug reaction. And so I'll just touch on why adverse drug reactions are problematic, and then I'll give a brief background to Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and then I'll talk about the development of the passport and the impact that such a tool can have on the care and experience of our patients. And so why are adverse drug reactions problematic? Well, they're a major cause of morbidity and mortality, and they place a huge burden on healthcare systems across the world. And a study that was conducted back in 2004 by Professor Pir Mohammed and colleagues was able to show that approximately 6.5% of admissions to our A&E departments, was as a result of an adverse drug reaction. And at the time of publication, this cost in the region of £466 million annually. Now, more recently, Prof. Pir Mohammed, along with Ossen Lau and colleagues, did a follow-up study, again, in the accident, looking at admissions to accident and emergency. And they were exploring admissions as a result of an adverse drug reaction. And so they noticed a stark increase in this figure, and the findings suggested that the figure had increased significantly, and 16.5% of admissions to our hospitals are as a result of an adverse drug reaction, with a projected cost of greater than £2.2 billion annually. And so I think that is a huge cost, a huge burden to the NHS, but more importantly is the actual impact that an adverse drug reaction can have on our patients and their quality of life. And so what are we doing as researchers then to address this problem? Well, Professor Sir Pir Mohammed is the director of the Wolfson Centre for Personalised Medicine, which is housed at the University of Liverpool. And within the centre, we conduct lots of research to help us better understand, predict and prevent reactions to medicines. Now, the majority of work that we do in the centre is pharmacogenomic in nature. And I'm sure some of you would have heard this term, pharmacogenomics or pharmacogenetics, or perhaps personalised medicine. And although there are some small subtle differences in these terms, they're often used interchangeably. But put simply, it's just the study of how genetic variation can influence response to medicines. And ultimately, what we strive for with pharmacogenomics is to ensure that we can prescribe the right drug at the right dose for our patients. And we want to make sure that we can get the maximum benefit from that medicine while we minimise any toxicity or harm associated with the medicine. Now, we all know that there's lots of different factors that can influence how we respond to a medicine. We know that we've got age, comorbidities, polypharmacy, ethnicity, but there's increasing scientific evidence to suggest that the natural variability in individual genes can influence our response to medicines and whether it will work really well for us or whether we will experience a reaction. And I just wanted to touch on this really because this is exceptionally important when we're considering serious adverse drug reactions such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome, which I mentioned earlier on. And so for those of you again who've not heard of this or don't know anything about this syndrome, excuse me, Stevens-Johnson syndrome is a potentially fatal reaction that can be caused by a viral infection, but it's more commonly caused by a medication. It can be caused by any medication, including those purchased over the counter and herbal medicines, but the more commonly implicated drug groups include your anticonvulsants, antibiotics, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and allopurinol, a drug that we use to treat gout. Now, when our patients present to accident and emergency, often the symptoms are non-specific initially. So they may present with symptoms such as a fever, a headache, a little bit of a respiratory tract infection, but this can very quickly develop into a blistering rash that predominantly affects the skin, but can also affect the mucous membranes. And depending on the severity of this condition, it can progress to what we call toxic epidermal necrolysis, or TEN. And as you can see from this graphic on the screen, the diagnosis is based on clinical presentation. So for a patient who loses who has up to 10% of their body surface area affected by blistering, then they will be diagnosed with SJS. But for those patients who unfortunately experience greater than 30% of body surface area involvement, then they are diagnosed with what we call TEN, toxic epidermal necrolysis. And some of our patients, unfortunately and very sadly, can lose up to 90% of their skin due to the blistering. Now, I think it's really an important point in the presentation just to highlight that we know that thankfully the majority of medicines that we see in clinical practice, they work really well, and adverse drug reactions tend to resolve once the culprit medication is either stopped or the dose is reduced. And thankfully the serious reactions such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome are uncommon, and I think it's really important to highlight that. So just to tell you a little bit more about Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and not to alarm you, but this is how the condition can present, how our patients can present to hospital when they're in hospital. And so it's a truly devastating reaction, and the morbidity and mortality is considerable, and any organ system in the body can be affected by this condition. So patients can lose their sight, their eyelashes grow inwardly and have to be surgically removed, they lose their nail beds, it can affect the respiratory, the gastro, the gynae systems, but importantly it affects them from a psychological perspective, and they can end up developing post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, patients are often treated in an intensive care unit, and depending on the severity again, they can be moved to a regional burn unit. And I think really important to highlight that there is also delayed sequelae associated with this condition. And so patients can often develop some of these conditions later on, 2 years down the line, so they don't really know what to expect from the condition. So basically, it's a devastating reaction, and it needs a multidisciplinary approach to care. And so I think it's important to highlight here that unfortunately we are unable to predict which patients will develop from SJS to TEN. We don't know if patients will lose their sight or whether they'll experience one of the long-term conditions, or whether they will experience all of the conditions I've just mentioned before. And so that's why research in this area is exceptionally important. And again, not to talk too much about this slide, but I think it's really important to highlight again why pharmacogenomics is really important with the likes of these serious drug reactions, because it has great potential to predict and prevent these reactions happening to our patients. And although I won't talk through the whole slide, I'd just like to draw your attention to the top row, just to give you an example how research in this area has been translated into clinical practice for the benefits of patients. So if you think about carbamazepine, it's a very successful drug which is used for epilepsy and other conditions, but we know that SJS is a side effect to this medicine. And we know that following extensive research, there was a strong association between carbamazepine-induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome in the presence of the HLA-B1502 gene, but that was just in the Han Chinese population. And so that's where your ethnicity fits in. And following replication of this research, we know then that the Food and Drug Administration in America and the then European Medicines Agency, they placed a screening program in place so that every single patient who who was going to be prescribed this medicine would be genetically tested prior to prescription to prevent this kind of reaction happening. Similar story, just for example, with the third row down with the bacavir. Same story, just that was across a range of ethnicities. And again, a screening program was put in place, and every single patient now who's prescribed a bacavir is genetically tested. And I could go on all day about that, giving you lots of examples of how pharmacogenetics has been brought into clinical practice to improve outcomes for patients, but that's not really the point of the presentation today. And so I just wanted to say that I think it's really important to highlight the clinical and scientific research is very important to make sure that we can prevent these reactions happening and we can make medications safer for our patients. Now, to complement the scientific and clinical research activity in this area, I set up a patient and public involvement group, a drug safety patient and public involvement group about 12 years ago. And I wanted to, I was very curious really, I wanted to explore with them what they felt was important to them about research, and did they think that our research strategy was relevant, and were we actually addressing the needs of this population. And so what I found from the patients was they were absolutely, very grateful for all the research that we're currently doing to address this problem with medicines, but they highlighted that one of the major problems for them was the lack of awareness of SJS and 10, and the lack of awareness of the associated conditions, long-term conditions that they had to live with and they had to manage. And so would it be possible for us to then work together on some research projects to try to address this? And so we have worked together on a number of incredible initiatives since then, and again, not enough time to talk through these, but we designed a poster to raise awareness of SJS-10, which was circulated nationally by the then clinical research networks. We also work quite closely with the MHRA Yellow Card Scheme, because we try and promote and encourage the reporting of such reactions through this system to try and make medicines safer. But most importantly, one of the ideas that came from the patient group was to develop a tool called the My SJS Passport. And the reason why they wanted to do this was because they felt that there was a lack of preparation and a lack of kind of coordination of their care post-discharge. And they thought a booklet like this might prepare them to manage these conditions. They also thought that having a compact booklet, handheld compact booklet with all of that information in, would be absolutely perfect to take to all of their appointments. Because as you can imagine, they'd see ophthalmologists, dermatologists, they'd often go to A&E, they'd be seeing all of these different healthcare professionals who they then had to explain again from the very beginning what SJS is. These are all the conditions I have to deal with, and nobody knew about it. So this was a brilliant tool for them to take with them and empowered them to be able to discuss their condition with their healthcare professionals. And importantly, they wanted on that passport a note to the University of Liverpool for the research that's going on, so that they could alert people to the available research that they could get involved in, as well as highlighting the importance of reporting adverse drug reactions. And so I quickly recognised we designed this passport together. We co-produced this. It went through a process of iteration. We arrived at the version 1, and then we realised that how are we going to get this into practice? And so we tried through the charity, SJS Awareness UK charity in London. We worked with some dermatology departments, but I recognised that this was never going to make it into the NHS if we didn't have the evidence to back it up about its acceptability, its benefit. And so I discussed with my supervisors, Munir Pir Mohammed, Jenny Downing and Andrew Thompson, and we agreed that this would be a really great project, the smallest project of one of 3 to be conducted under my PhD, under the programme of work of my PhD. And so what we did is we wanted to implement this passport to be used by those with lived experience of SJS in a real-world setting. And the aim was really to gain the basic perceptions of participants on its acceptability and usability by means of a questionnaire. I also wanted to get a little bit more of a deeper and more meaningful understanding of the value of the passport, its benefits, and any barriers to implementation. And I did this through some focus groups. And so our intention was to recruit 50 participants, all with lived experience, and that could be someone who was diagnosed with SJS, or a carer, a guardian, perhaps a parent. And so we went out and we started to recruit, but unfortunately the pandemic came in the middle of this, and I had to go and work on urgent public health research for 18 months and kind of leave behind my PhD for a little while. We did recruit 26 participants, and they all used the passport for sufficient time. And so collectively, the supervisory team agreed that this was an adequate cohort of patients for us to be able to support or refute the benefits of the passport. And so we continued with the project. They basically all completed a questionnaire at the end of the study, and then I conducted 2 focus groups. And although I haven't got time today to go into detail, I just wanted to share with you some of the results from the project. And so collectively, from the mixed methods approach, I'll just share the results. And so the participants, they fed back that they thought the passport was like their voice. And that was just key to them. And this was particularly so when they were attending accident and emergency departments. Quite often they were seeing a range of different healthcare professionals who'd never heard of this condition, who didn't understand all of the associated long-term conditions they were managing. And they were absolutely terrified in case they were going to be prescribed that culprit drug again. And so this passport was, that booklet could be given to the healthcare professional if they couldn't speak for themselves, by one of their family members, and then they were reassured that the drug would not be prescribed again and it would prevent another adverse drug reaction or another episode of SJS, more importantly. They also, the findings also suggested that it validated diagnosis, and this was not just amongst healthcare professionals, but it also validated the diagnosis to their families, who often thought once they'd been diagnosed and they'd recovered from the acute phase, that it was over, but it wasn't. They were still managing all those long-term health problems. They also found it really useful for young people in the transition from child to adult services. And this was particularly so during COVID, when some youngsters had to go into hospital themselves without their parents, and having that passport there with them to explain their condition was an absolute godsend, they said. And so they thought it was great as well for raising awareness of Stevens-Johnson syndrome amongst healthcare professionals. There are some quotes there, but I'm sure the slides will be shared later and you can have a look at those at a later date. Now, there were all the wonderful benefits, but there were some recommendations or some limitations and recommendations for refinement of the passport. And the participants suggested that it needed slight adjustment with regards to its section prioritisation and also a little bit more personalisation within the passport. They also suggested that it would be useful as an app, so they could tap into it anywhere and have more space to record all of their information. And importantly, they said it would be really helpful if they received this passport at point of diagnosis rather than a number of years down the line, because it would help them prepare for what was about to start, the journey they were about to start with their SJS. And so just to summarise really, this passport was designed by survivors for survivors. It was then implemented and evaluated through a mixed methods approach. It's produced some really beneficial, produced some evidence of benefits of the passport along some minor recommendations for minor changes. But most importantly, what's happened is that we've developed some really strong collaborations along the way. And so once I had all this strong evidence to suggest that this was really beneficial for this patient cohort, I realised then we had to consider how we're going to get this into clinical practice. And so I contacted the British Association of Dermatologists and asked, explained the research and asked, could this be embedded into the national SJS guideline? And they were really impressed with this tool, and they want to put it in the guideline. That's really, the guideline's actually going to be revised and updated later this year. So they said once I've published the findings, then we'll reconvene and it's going to be embedded into the guideline. And so this is brilliant, because what this does is create accessibility for every single healthcare professional to be able to access this and provide patients it at the point of diagnosis. I'm also working closely with the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and I've introduced them now to SJS Awareness UK and to our drug safety patient group, who are working closely with the MHRA on their new yellow card biobank to explore allopurinol-induced Stevens-Johnson syndrome. And every single patient who's recruited through that biobank will now be given one of the passports for them to use, which is an absolutely such a great impact with both the British Association of Dermatology and the MHRA. And then finally, just wanted to briefly touch on education. I haven't got time to play a video, I don't think. No, but I've put a link here, and I think it's really important. I would strongly urge you to watch this video. This is a patient of ours, Jane Burns, who often comes to these venues with me, but she's away at the moment. Jane experienced SJS and was admitted to the Royal Liverpool Accident and Emergency Department about 39 years ago. She was thankfully being treated by Professor Pir Mohammed and his colleagues, and Professor Pir Mohammed had an interest in research and in adverse drug reactions, and he very quickly recognised that she was having a reaction to her epilepsy medicines, and that drug was withdrawn, and she developed toxic epidermal necrolysis, but she survived and she recovered, which is wonderful. And so Jane, since then, has been working on our patient group. She has been fantastic in supporting me now in raising awareness of not just adverse drug reactions of SJS, of the importance of research, of embedding pharmacogenomics into clinical practice. And she comes with me to higher education institutes now, where we present to non-medical prescribers, to junior medics. And we also, Jane and I, have worked with the Academy of Medical Sciences in London to produce this video, this educational tool, which has been circulated widely across the genomic centres across the country so that they can use it as an educational tool also. And so from an educational perspective, it's absolutely wonderful. But most importantly, it's just the best thing to have patients involved in your research, because they really can contribute to your research strategy, and they make sure that your research is relevant, and they make sure that we are actually conducting research that is important to them. And so I'd just like to finish there by saying thank you. Sorry, yeah, that's Jane's video there. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm aware that it is now time for the conference to finish. Okay. Are there any burning questions?
Just about costs in America.
Sorry.
Just about the costs in America. I'm sure they'll pass that to the patient, and the patient will pay for the test to say that they can have carbamazepine, for instance. How do you think that's going to be in the UK if we end up doing genomics for every drug that we might be using, and the cost that will cause for the National Health Service when it is so stripped at the moment? And again, I think this is amazing and it's the right answer, but we're talking about cost.
It's a very, very good question. I think there's a panel of greater than 40 medicines at the moment, maybe a bit more, possibly 60, where we have the evidence to suggest that these medicines will be better prescribed in relation to their, to genetics, to the particular genes. But again, there's lots of issues. There's cost, for one. There's also education to the local clinicians and getting that confidence and training in place to be able to apply pharmacogenomics into clinical practice. But I think what's going to help us is the regional pharmacogenomic centres. So what we have now is we can have referrals from your local NHS organisations who can refer to the genomic centres, who will do the genetic testing for you and get the results back to you very, very quickly now. And that then can inform the prescription for the individual. So, and improve outcomes. So.
Quite straightforward. The pharma company should pay for the genomics if they have a drug that causes those problems. To me, seems quite simple. They've usually made plenty of money out of it. I would not. I mean, there's a real issue here about where health if there's extra money coming to the NHS, where it goes, and that's why we have NICE, and the US has tried to introduce a NICE equivalent and failed because of legislation. People took it to court and said it was restraint of trade. So we're very different from the US. Tony, and that's the last question. So
I was just going to follow on from that, actually. I mean, it's likely that testing is cost effective because of the absolute cost of being admitted with Stevens-Johnson and toxic epidermal necrolysis, massive cost to the NHS. So avoiding that with testing, it's probably cost effective. So the NHS probably saves money, even though it's...
but it needs a health economist to do the work.
Yes, and some of that work's already been done, and a whole genome screen these days is about the same price as an MRI scan, so it's the costs are coming down.
I think that's really important, Tony, and I didn't get a chance, because it's a short presentation, to elaborate on some of the studies and the cost effectiveness, and it really is, in some areas, for some particular medicines, the cost effectiveness evidence is there to suggest that it would be beneficial within the NHS rather than the patient being at risk.
And there are point of care tests, you know, blood tests there and then with the patient. It's not a sample that goes to the lab.
No, absolutely. But it's about getting that cost-effective evidence. Again, this is why we have ARCs, because we can bring the right people to the right place to undertake something like that. Oh, I thought you were going to ask a question. I was going to say, right. So I'm not going to do any long post-speech. Well done for everybody. Great talks. Thank you very much, Tony, for suggesting it. Our next ArcFest is in Oxenholme on the 10th September. It's a Tuesday. And it'll be it's likely to talk about ARC. We'll probably have a races workshop, because it's a workshop ArcFest, so it's face-to-face only. So please put it in your diaries, those of you who are online, because because if you want to come to the next ArcFest, you'll need to be there in person. I'm expecting that there will be a World Cafe type Arc 2 workshop happening in a room where people can dip in and out and see where we're up to with progressing with the next bid, should that be live at that time, or planning for the next bid. And we're yet to think about what the other workshop will be on that day to run alongside that, or themed. There may be one in the morning, one in the afternoon, but that's where our thinking is up to as we speak now. And for staff, it's the away day the next day, so please get it in your diaries now. I don't think there's any other announcements I need to make other than thank you very much for attending. Thank you very much for those of you who've been with us online. Synapses are firing, that's good to hear, online. We've still got over 70 people in the room and online, so thank you for staying to the end. We peaked at about 105, 110, I think, so great attendance as always. Great to see so many of you here. Safe journey home,